In the first chapter of this series, we've begun to look at the dedicated propagandist profession. Yet the greatest players within the world of propaganda do not announce themselves as such. They are primarily media and governments. So as we continue our exploration of propaganda, manipulation, and psychological operations, we now move to the two great hearts of media and propaganda, Madison Avenue and Fleet Street. The earliest chapter in this story begins on Fleet Street. In the 1620s, the first English weeklies would be published in London, paving the way for the modern newsprint industry. By 1702, the Daily Current would become the United Kingdom's first daily newspaper to be published. Its publication would occur near Fleet Street in London, setting the stage for this part of the city to become the nation's main hub for newspapers and publishing. Over the 18th century, this industry would grow, slow and steady. Yet in the mid-18th century, beginning in 1836, stamp duties would begin to be abolished. Up to this point, there were duties paid on news publications. Yet over the years of 1836 to 1855, this began to be removed. As a result, the cost of newspapers and magazines would drop precipitously, vastly expanding the market. In 1855, after complete abolition of stamp duty, the Daily Telegraph would become the first penny newspaper. And with newspapers becoming so cheap and mass-produced, journalism was becoming a mass industry. In the 1870s, Thomas Barrett of Pear's Soap Company would pioneer modern branding. He would mass-market soap using slogans and imagery. This was a novel concept at the time, using simple phrases and images to attach a brand in the minds of the public, and he had great success. Thus, his methods would be adopted by others. At this point, the industry was growing very large, and there was a convergence between the newsprint industry and the advertising industry, both using the print medium to spread their ideas. And as this industry was becoming so large and influential, very wealthy power players began to emerge. In the early 20th century, major newspaper owners like Lord Northcliffe, the owner of the Daily Mail and Daily Mirror, would establish powerful national chains. They were becoming the first media tycoons, and by holding multiple, extremely influential newspaper and magazine properties, this made them very influential, and people who politicians wanted to be on the good side of. Around this time, there was a burst of investigative journalists and muckrakers in the United States. They were exposing corporate and political abuses, as well as some less true accusations. This was causing a major backlash from politicians and corporations in the United States, and business in the United Kingdom took notice. There was a realization that there was a need for public relations professionals. Figures like Ivy Lee began to emerge. Their job was to put out a positive image of figures and corporations, and to spin and squish down negative press. Yet for the newspaper men who were more interested in political machination, they realized that they could play both industries at once, acting as newsmakers and public relations propagandists. During the First World War, there would be an enormous emergence of propaganda. Under the direction of H.H. Asquith, Lloyd George, and Charles Masterman, Wellington House would be established. The aim of this institution was to coordinate internal and external propaganda, to engage in mass persuasion for the war effort, and perhaps above all else, to influence neutral countries into joining the British war cause, particularly the United States. This was the first truly mass-scale government propaganda campaign in the country, and those involved would immediately realize its power, particularly as the United States was convinced to join. Similarly to what we saw with Edward Bernays in the United States, following the war, there was an emergence of a public relations industry, with professionals realizing that techniques used in wartime could very well be applied in peacetime. In 1924, Basil Clark would establish the first British PR consultancy, Editorial Services. Public relations had begun as an industry in the United Kingdom, and while this would hold great significance, particularly on the corporate end of things, the following decades would see the staggering emergence of state propaganda. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, the British Broadcasting Corporation would be developed. Its aim was to send state messaging across the empire. It would particularly make use of documentary films, projecting images, narratives, stories that the state wanted to be spread. And as this became the main source of information for Britons, as well as those in the wider empire, particularly as television emerged as the dominant source of media, this would allow government messaging to be ubiquitous. The state had achieved something incredible. The main source of information for people was the state. This project would be primarily driven by civil servants, with one significant example being Sir Stephen Tallents via the Empire Marketing Board and the GPO. The idea within Whitehall was what one might expect, that getting the population to accept, believe, and propagate state narratives was really convenient for the bureaucracy. Throughout this time, Fleet Street remained dominant, and the British newsprint industry was enormous. Yet by the 1960s, Fleet Street's power was very concentrated, yet its production methods were aging and deteriorating. One major issue facing the industry was that it had become entirely reliant on powerful print unions, and at this point within the nation's history, the unions were extremely powerful and could enforce their demands. Over the decades of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, strikes became exceedingly commonplace. Britons losing power, Britons seeing trash pile-ups in their cities, and for Fleet Street, they knew that they had to play ball with the unions, and industrial conflict appeared to be rising. This would continue throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, as the power of unions remained unchecked. Yet there would be a massive shift in 1986. Rupert Murdoch's News International would secretly move production out of Fleet Street to a technologically advanced plant in Wapping. The result of this was to show that the print unions were not all powerful, and they would begin to break as more Fleet Street firms began to diversify or leave. And by the 1990s, Fleet Street would no longer be the physical home of British news media. And through the following decades of the 1990s and early 2000s, it had become evident that the power of Fleet Street was diffusing across London, but also the internet. Digital media was rising, and rising incredibly rapidly. Firms had to adapt, yet many of them did not. This caused substantial disruption across the industry, as some were forced out and gave way to new firms. We will dive further into internet propaganda later on in this series. Yet, as we leave off here with the history of Fleet Street, we find that today, Fleet Street remains as a metonym for UK journalism. Yet Fleet Street itself is no longer truly the home of the industry, and many of the old Fleet Street firms have given way to internet media. Today it's self-evident to everyone that the internet is dominant, and at the same time, UK media is losing its power. It's losing its control over narrative, and the BBC itself appears to be in an increasingly precarious position. Yet let's look at some of the methods employed by this industry. Going back to the Indian Rebellion of 1857, some of the first widespread state propaganda would emerge in an effort to galvanize support against the rebels. They would depict Indian atrocities, designed to elicit emotional responses, attempting to garner support for the cause and military actions. In 1918, the Ministry of Information would be formed, and formed at the cabinet level. This was a direct propaganda arm of the British state, and would be responsible for some very iconic wartime images, including, after being re-established in 1939 for the Second World War, the iconic Keep Calm and Carry On poster. And in 1948, the Information Research Department was created as a secret covert propaganda and counter-propaganda anti-Soviet unit. Its founding purpose was for Cold War application, attempting to counter Soviet narratives, and to entrench British ones. They would feed stories to journalists, publishers, and academics, often without their knowledge, feeding anti-Soviet narratives into the zeitgeist in a way designed to appear organic. And this would become an increasingly prevalent form of propaganda, as it was realized that people could identify state propaganda as propaganda when it was clear that it came from the state. Yet, if it appeared to come from neutral third parties, then it became a whole lot more effective. Today, the state propaganda arms have moved heavily into the internet, forming a network of intelligence, media, and the bureaucracy. United Kingdom state propaganda remains a very substantial apparatus with some highly sophisticated psychological techniques. They may be perhaps the greatest nation in history in terms of propaganda. Yet, let's now turn our attention to Madison Avenue. Newspapers, magazines, and pamphlets were quite common in the American colonies. In 1704, the first newspaper advertisement published in the colonies would appear in the Boston Newsletter. In contrast to our overview of the United Kingdom, we're going to pay particular attention to the advertising industry in the United States, as for a long time, American media has been more dispersed, and where the United States really shines is just how pioneering it is in advertising. In the 1770s, the American Revolution would cause a rapid expansion and many new innovations within propaganda, with one major example that yielded tremendous influence for the Revolution were the pamphlets and newspapers of Thomas Paine, Common Sense. And as the United States formed into its own country, it would have a quite robust newspaper and magazine industry, and one which existed across all of the different regions, often with quite different characters, instead of, in the case of Britain, there being a clear consolidation within London. Within the early United States, you would see things like newspapers in the north, and newspapers in the south having their own unique characters. In 1841, Volney Palmer would open the first American advertising agency in Philadelphia, acting as a broker within the newspaper industry. This business would do quite well, and by the 1860s, advertising would shift from simple space brokerage to an agency model, with firms like J. Walter Thompson emerging. At this point, the United States was beginning to see an enormous industrial revolution, with fabulous wealth being created. Commerce was reigning supreme in the United States. In the 1880s, magazine and newspaper advertising would explode, driven by the growth of national consumer brands like Sears or Coca-Cola. Enormous and rapidly growing businesses would pour quite a great deal of money into advertising themselves, particularly as consumer brands relied heavily on the associations that people had of them, their name, their image, and their recognizability. They wanted to be on people's minds. And as Gilded Age America entered the 20th century, a public relations industry would emerge. Corporate public relations would take hold as major businesses would hire former journalists to manage their image. This would all carry a pace and grow as the United States economy as a whole was growing, with many of these large consumer brands becoming juggernauts, and companies many states over could become household names. Yet as the First World War emerged, the United States would make a major leap in public relations and propaganda. The government would form the Committee on Public Information, led by George Creel. This would be the beginning of large-scale and systematic propaganda on the part of the government. Its primary goal was selling the war, maintaining morale, and projecting the government's message of the war to everyone. This is where figures like Edward Bernays begin to emerge, and particularly as the war came to a close, these methods would be applied to commercial purposes. In the 1920s, Madison Avenue would be defined, as major advertising agencies like BBDO and Y&R would consolidate in Midtown Manhattan. By 1937, nearly 40% of the industry would be located on Madison Ave. The industry would explode rapidly, with a key moment often cited as the 1923 publication of Edward Bernays' Crystallizing Public Opinion. They were going beyond mere advertising. They were sculpting public opinion, and often using extremely manipulative methods to get it done. Methods like appeals to authority, appeals to unconscious desires, appeals to fear, and a very heavy use of group psychology, an area which had been being developed to quite a great extent over the prior decades. These firms were selling narratives, selling images, and were no longer simply pitching products, but were aiming to sculpt the minds of entire groups. And in the 1940s and 50s, they would get one of their greatest toys imaginable, the television. During this period, the television era was emerging. Madison Avenue did very good business during these years. During the early days of mass adoption of the television, the main advertising approach was the rational man approach. This worked by using repetitive hard sells, explaining very directly why you should buy this product. Our asbestos is better than the competitor's asbestos. You don't want to see your home catching on fire, so you want asbestos. Asbestos from the bestest. A notable practitioner of this method would be Russell Reeves. We also begin to see the expansion of jingles, the idea of having a short, easily identifiable little bit of music, a simple melody which would stay in one's mind, maintaining brand awareness. And quite a lot began to change along with culture during the 1960s. This period in advertising has been termed the Creative Revolution. This is the period in American advertising that is depicted in the show Mad Men, which, just as a note, it's wild that there was an enormously successful series about 1960s ad men. During this period, Madison Avenue began to focus on wit, creativity, and shifted from a hard sell approach to the soft sell. Figures like Bill Bernbach and David Ogilvy would emerge at this point. As culture was changing across the Anglo sphere, advertisers were realizing that the hard sell was no longer as effective. Culture was changing. In America and Britain alike, the 1960s was something quite different. People were seeking something a little softer, so they focused on the artistic, moods and expressions, much more focused on connecting a certain feeling to a product, as opposed to directly spelling out why one should buy it. At this point, an advertiser may not even pitch what the product is or why one should buy it at all, instead attempting to connect feeling, expression, colorfulness, mood to the product. And this would be dominant going into the 1970s. In the 1980s, however, Madison Avenue became global, as many major advertising firms began merging into large global conglomerates, such as Omnicom or WPP. Many of these long-established firms would physically move out of Madison Ave, many to headquarters in downtown Manhattan, yet many internationally. The period of globalization was really in full force, and now a company in one country may be responsible for the advertising of a product in another, hired by the company producing it in a third country, and this began to globalize advertising and propaganda as a whole. Across the globe, it's the same story. The 1990s and early 2000s were the shift to digital. Yet in the case of Madison Ave, their big competition became Silicon Valley tech firms, as many of them were becoming increasingly involved in advertising. Meanwhile, this was the same for the media across the United States, though the true weight of the shift to Silicon Valley wouldn't be felt until the 2010s. Let's take a look at some methods and developments that define the American style. Beginning in 1776, Thomas Paine's common sense pamphlets and newspapers were highly effective, paving the way for American-style, wartime, and political propaganda. Yet a major revolution would occur in the 1890s during the Spanish-American War. Large news firms would begin engaging in yellow journalism, with notable example, Hearst, the news empire built up by William Randolph Hearst. The Spanish-American War is a fantastic example of the progenitors of 20th century propaganda. One thing that's really notable here is very often they avoided outright lies. For example, when discussing the attack on the Maine, the major rallying story to bring people in support of the Spanish-American War, there would be headlines like "Sabotage," with a little question mark, or a big headline, "Spain guilty," and then if you go on to actually read it, it says, "Maybe." Another one, in big letters, "Crisis at hand," and below it, "Spanish treachery." And right in the middle, in vastly smaller letters, growing belief in. Today, this would just seem over the top, although the same general approach is still being employed, just a bit more subtle. They didn't have to outright lie, per se. It's true, and it's not a lie. It's something that one might think. And if one were trying to say what could maybe be said in a way that's reasonable to what you would if you were trying to, it isn't a lie. And that was the approach. Yeah, it was a lie. During the First World War, the Committee on Public Information would employ 75,000 Minutemen, volunteer orators who would give patriotic speeches in theaters, attempting to rally people to the war effort. There would as well be a burst in the creation of patriotic posters, including some very iconic ones, such as James Montgomery Flagg's Uncle Sam Wants You. The government would commission film and news releases to manufacture consent, a term which we will be exploring more in further episodes. They were attempting to demonize Germany, suppress dissent, and boost morale for the campaign. During the Second World War, President Roosevelt would fund organizations like the Writers' War Board, an organization which mobilized thousands of writers to embed government messaging in pop culture, the press, and books. Second World War was more sophisticated, organized, and funded. It as well had many new techniques that had been developed during the interwar period by figures like Bernays. In 1942, Roosevelt would establish the Office of War Information to coordinate government information and messaging, and to promote understanding of war policies. For example, the quite long Why We Fight series. I mean, can you imagine someone watching a documentary series that long? I mean, who would make something like that? Anyone who would take that much time to make a documentary that long must be pretty boring. They would work quite closely with Hollywood to shape narratives. The main goal here was narrative construction and control. Not simply giving their pitch, but controlling the entire informational milieu of the country, so that everything one interacted with was the war story. This was very effective, and remained a quite dominant strategy by the American government, at least until the internet age, ever since it's become more and more difficult to pull off. In the 1950s through the 1970s, Operation Mockingbird would be a CIA program to recruit and pay American and foreign journalists, editors, and media organizations to publish, suppress, or modify stories for foreign policy aims. As the Cold War was picking up, intelligence was becoming increasingly involved in directly controlling the media, and the relationship between intelligence and the media began to grow, ultimately becoming a very close relationship, with many journalists having their main sources be the intelligence agencies, and editors on record talking about how they were pretty much stuck saying whatever the agencies wanted. All the while, this not being known to the public, creating state media with the facade of being independent. In 1967, Ramparts magazine would reveal that the CIA was funding organizations like the National Student Association and prominent culture magazines like Encounter, with the goal of using them for narrative construction and manipulation. And this is a quite interesting one, as now it shows propaganda going outside the realm of media and advertising, and going into cultural institutions directly. At the same time, intelligence agencies were increasingly relying on thought leaders, attempting to shape public opinion using the same classic appeal to authority methods that had been in place since the 1920s, but doing so in a way that appeared organic, sometimes without the authority figure even knowing that they were propagating a narrative on behalf of the government. This would play a very large role in the 1960s, particularly as there were massive cultural changes underway. The agencies would seek out musicians, artists, and academics, imparting their messages to those figures who in turn brought it to those who were influenced by them, injecting narratives into a population in a way that made it seem to them as though they had organically come up with it themselves. This is really powerful. Just a thought. Maybe Timothy Leary. In the 1970s, with the commencement of the war on drugs, there were many mass media campaigns that were a part of it, including very heavy use of public service announcements. The government would enter into many media partnerships to shape opinion. There aren't enormous method changes with this, yet it's quite notable for its scale. The government was going into everywhere it could in order to put out the message, including the famous Just Say No campaign that emerged in the 1980s. The Iraq War and the global war on terror would see substantial leaps in propaganda and manipulation techniques. Over the period of 2003 to 2005, reports would emerge that the United States military had paid Iraqi newspapers to publish articles written by the military itself, and had them disguised as local Iraqi newspapers that appeared unbiased. This is another very powerful technique, and one which the government has made use of domestically as well, directly coming up with the news, directly inventing the narrative, yet passing it off to a media source that people largely trust, and don't suspect would possibly be government propaganda, thus getting people's guard down. And though we will be talking about the internet age in later episodes, the last major point to address is that in 2012, the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act would be passed. This would repeal the domestic restrictions of the 1948 Smith-Mundt Act. The effect was to remove the legal restrictions on the government directly propagandizing the public. Ever since 2012, the law has said that the government may apply propaganda to American citizens. Now, they were already doing this. They were doing propaganda all the time. Yet, now having an act of Congress repeal the restrictions that at least on paper said that they couldn't, well, that's a quite substantial change in the relationship between the people and the government. And as we go forward with this series, we will see what they have done ever since then. Yet as we leave off here, the 20th century saw the United States and the United Kingdom becoming absolute powerhouses of media, propaganda, and manipulation, with a great deal of their histories being shaped by these manipulative efforts. Yet there is much more to the story, much more depth, and some of the techniques discovered, particularly by military and intelligence research, may be quite shocking and horrifying, for the game of power relies quite heavily on manipulation, and those who seek power above all else are willing to go to lengths that most people just don't want to imagine.